Welcome, champions, to the place where we rank the champions of idle champions, seat by seat, while we go over their mechanics to explain why I'm putting them where I'm putting them. Today we're getting ever closer to wrapping up this series with seat 11 out of 12. This seat in particular is quite competitive, with a lot of useful champions, ranging widely in what they offer to your formations. And you know it, we're starting with the core champion of the seat, then working our way down alphabetically. That means today we're starting with Jamilah, and Jemima, the true neutral human barbarian. She serves exclusively as a DPS, although to call her a DPS is a bit of a misnomer, as she'd actually need to deal damage for that. She scales up her damage based on how many tanks she is adjacent to with frontline fighter, stacking multiplicatively. Her damage is also increased with Berserker Confidence, which scales up based on how many temporary hit points she currently has, capped at 2 times her maximum health. You can increase her health with unarmored defense to increase this, which synergizes with frontline fighter in that her health is increased by 10% of the tank's health that she is adjacent to. And she also benefits from retaliation, increasing her damage for each enemy attacking her or those adjacent tanks, or rather any adjacent champion, but ideally tanks. Her specialization is a simple choice between increasing the buffing potential of either frontline fighter by 100% or Berserker Confidence by 400%. And her ultimate has her go into a rage and leaps from enemy to enemy, attacking 6 times. Ultimately, she is at the bottom of the barrel as a DPS, all the way down there with Rosie. As a core champion that only offers the DPS role and can already be outperformed by other core champions that serve as DPS in seats before her, she really just never finds a footing. She is a prime candidate for a rework, and maybe even Force Grey, her affiliation, can get a season of their own. I think she could even benefit from leaning into the idea of being an off-tank a la Barrowin, and becoming a little DPS support tank hybrid. At any rate, as she is, I hate to do it to him, she's a hard F. Second in line is Avren, the chaotic neutral half-elf sorcerer / warlock, who serves as a support. He's one of those that might seem slightly complicated at first glance, but he's actually very simple and very effective, as in probably the overall best support in the entire game. Everything revolves around his mirror image, where every 15 seconds he creates an image of himself over another champion, picking one at random, for 30 seconds, which grants buffs based on their roles. DPS will have their own damage increased, supports will offer an additional damage buff, and tanks will have healing increased on them. Champions will receive all applicable buffs based on their roles. So for example, a DPS that is also a support, like Zorbu or Ashara, will gain both the self-DPS increase and the global damage increase and benefit from both. He has 2 spec choices, both revolving around this formation ability. First, you can choose to prioritize good, neutral, or evil champions with mirror images application. Unlike Freely, where it's debatable whether you want to choose the alignment of your DPS or not, that is not a question here. Almost always pick the alignment of your DPS, because the DPS buff from mirror image is a larger increase than the global support buff, and especially if your main DPS is also a support since you want both active. Second is either increasing the effect or duration of mirror image. The duration is the better increase here, and I'll explain why. The why is actually the reason Avren is so good. Each separate image is its own unique buff, meaning every image that's active is a multiplicative buff. With a durational increase, that means you will have a constant 4 images active. And if one of those is on a DPS that is also a support, that means you will have 5 different multiplicative buffs, and it just maintains on its own. And even then, we're not done. Avren also has Seeing Double, which will increase the damage of all champions for each champion he is adjacent to, which is further increased if those champions also actively have a mirror image on them. So position Avren next to as many champions as possible, and try to make them the alignment you've chosen from his specialization if your formation allows it. With his ultimate, he casts the level 2 spell, Enlarge/Reduce, to reduce the size and the damage output of enemies on screen, while enlarging himself to give enemies lay ol' boot to the face and knock them back. He's just damn good. Big ol' S tier. Next up is Dragonbait, the lawful good, Soriel Paladin and Evergreen champion, who serves as a tank and support. He's a strange balance of simple and complicated. Simple in that his kit revolves around a single formation ability, Shen State, but the amount it buffs and the range entirely depends upon how you form your formation and what the tags of the champion slotted are. It starts off as a fairly basic buff, and applies to only those adjacent to Dragonbait. But with Scent Pie Crust, the range extends by 1 slot for each healer slotted in your formation, and with Scent Roasted Vegetables, Shen State is increased for each enemy attacking Dragonbait, and every enraged stack, which is further increased for every tank slotted in the formation. All that's pretty simple. Where it gets a bit complicated is with Scent Meat Sauce, where Shen State is further increased for each support in the formation, but the amount depends on how many slots away they are from Dragonbait. Now this scales with gear, so I'm just going to use the base values to explain this. Natively, this will be increased by 50% for 1 slot away, 150% for 2, 100% for 3, 50% for 4, and 25% for 5 slots away. So the sweet spot is to try and get as many supports as you can 2 and 3 slots away for the best increase. This won't always be the case depending on the formation, especially if you have him in the front line tanking. That's why his specializations exist. His first specialization shakes up Meat Sauce by changing the values. 75% at 1 slot, 100 at 2, 125 at 3, 150 at 4, and 200 at 5. But as you probably gathered, this could actually make you get less out of it depending on the formation. So if you want to min-max here, you really need to consider how far away each support is from Dragonbait and decide which scaling is best for you. Or just take his second specialization, which increases Roasted Vegetables by 50%. But if you do take this, make sure you have him in the front line taking damage to proc it to begin with. His ultimate deals damage to all enemies on screen while clearing the group of any stuns or charms, and marks any fiends or undead left alive, who will take 400% additional damage. He's available for every patron, and his attributes are very good. Basically, he'll never be your first pick once your roster's fluffed up, but he's a solid champion to fall back on when you need some reliability once restrictions start kicking in. He'd probably be seeing more use if he wasn't in this seat, but for what he offers to the game, I think he's a high B. Now, next up is Nova, but I just covered her in my last video because of the seasons. If you want her full breakdown, check that video out. But as a quick reminder, she's an alright tank with great support that also recently became positional, and also has a debuff for click debuff formations. Her buffing numbers get very high, and I think she hovers between a high A and a low S, and I ended up putting her in a low S. Now moving on, we're led to Orisha, the neutral good ASMR cleric/bard, who is a DPS and support. She is a part of the fairly new affiliation, Sirens of the Realms, which also includes Brig in Seat 3 and Vlania in Seat 8. And while they overall have a small synergy together, Orisha is particularly tied to Vlania. Most of her kit revolves around Bardic Inspiration, which increases the damage of champions in one of 2 ways. First, if Vlania is in the formation, it increases the damage of champions along the shortest paths between herself and Vlania. But if out of the 2 of them you only slot Orisha, it just increases the damage of those adjacent to her for a lesser amount. Either way, whichever is active, Orisha will always receive its benefits. Toragard, preach. Excuse me. She also gains Flaming Wings, which will cause her to sprout, flaming wings, when you activate her ultimate attack, which by the way just deals damage to all enemies. But when activated, she will gain 30 stacks of her Flaming Wings, losing 1 per second. The damage of her primary attack, the multi-hitting level 2 spell Scorching Ray, is increased by a large amount per stack remaining. At 0 stacks, as you might imagine, the wings disappear. But if she gains a kill while it is active, the stacks reset back to 30, but will also start to decay much quicker. To pack it all up into a nice tight bundle, she also gets Diva Mode, which will increase both Flaming Wings and Bardic Connection if there is a boss monster on screen by a fair amount. She has 2 different specialization choices. The first either increasing the effect of Flaming Wings by 200%, or increasing the stack cap by 50%, so it scales up a little higher. The first will always give you a better damage upgrade, while the second will let you keep it up a little longer. Generally speaking, the first is better. Her second will solidify her as a support or damage dealer in your formation, either increasing the effect of Bardic Connection by 200%, or increasing Orisa's own damage for each champion under the effect of Bardic Connection, as well as allowing her to count for the more important parts of Lanya's enthralling performance regardless of positioning. As a DPS, she's in that mid-C range, but the fact she also is a support makes her climb on up. And of course, as a DPS, that's also a positional buffer, she's a prime candidate for an Artemis formation. I think she lands in a low B. Now let's get to Rust, the true neutral Tabaxi rogue, who fills the gold and support roles. Unless you're like some unnamed crazy person that hangs around here sometimes, you're more than likely to just use Rust only for his gold benefits. Let's start with his damage buff though, highest bidder, where he increases the damage of all champions for each order of magnitude of gold find you have. Look at the exponent of your gold find for that number. As you've probably gathered, the further you've pushed within a campaign and farmed gold, this will make the ability better. But the exponent scaling is additive, and the girth of the bonus is from the post-stack multiplier, so don't worry too much about it. You'll only really notice a steep difference when you're just starting out a campaign. But this also means he scales well with other gold find champions. For his gold find, he has Rust for Hire. The key to this ability is, not only is it a good, flat gold find buff, but there are just so many ways to scale it. First of all, it has a gear slot tied to it, as well as 2 different feats. But he even further scales it with a different formation ability, 1 gold piece, where he has a small chance to gain a shiny gold coin from any kill. But he also has a small chance to lose that coin when he attacks with his rapier, or using his ultimate. Note that his primary attack cycles through shooting with his pistols, then attacking 3 times with his rapier, rinse repeat. While actively holding the coin, he will increase Rust for Hire as well as highest bidder. And 1 gold piece also has a gear slot tied to it to scale everything even further. He can mitigate some of the jank in that gaining and losing of the coin with Hello Friends, where the chance to gain the coin is increased for each member of his affiliation, the Ox Venturers Guild, where the chance to gain the coin is increased for each member of his affiliation, the Ox Venturers Guild, that is slotted in your formation. But the real way to stop the jank of it is with one of his specializations. The first flat increasing the ability bonus of 1 gold piece by 100%, the second doing the same, but for each Ox Venturers Guild champion within 2 slots of him, stacking multiplicatively. Lastly, and most importantly, making him only attack with his pistols. So he'll only ever lose his coin once he gets it if you use his ultimate, which by the way loads him into a cannon and launches him at enemies, dealing damage in a large area with a large chance to lose his coin. It's really not worth it. Basically take the first if you're using him for a damage buff and aren't using his affiliation. Use the second if you are using his affiliation, and take the third if you're just using him for gold find and or an Azaka farm. He's not the greatest buffer, ranging from a low D with a very low amount of gold magnitude up to a high C with a large amount of gold magnitude and using his affiliation. But his gold find is like S tier. So for what he overall offers to the game, remember, that's how I do these tier lists, I think he's somewhere in the high B range. And don't forget, Merylwen in Seat 2 has a small synergy with him, where when you use her ultimate attack and they're both in your formation, you gain yet another gold find bonus. And Merylwen herself is no slacker in offering gold. Now we have Strix, the chaotic good tiefling sorcerer. Here we have another example of both simple and very effective. She can serve as DPS or support, and is fairly decent at both of them. To start with, she gains poor hygiene, cause she's stanky, where she applies a debuff when enemies get close enough, which makes them take increased damage from all sources. And you guessed it, this works for a click debuff formation. And while it is stinky, it is not sticky. She also gains Death Ward, where if any champion within 2 slots of her is about to be killed, she will revive them at 50% of their max health, and will take 50% of her own max health in damage if she can take that much without dying, which has a 30-second cooldown. She's also linked to death with her formation ability Haunted, where as long as she is slotted in your formation, she will keep track of every champion death, and increase all champion damage by 100% additively per death for that adventure. This is a constant stack, so you can farm it up as much as you want for a decent boost. But seeing as it's additive and the post-stack multiplier does not have any way to scale it, it falls off pretty steep at a certain point. But Strix is available for every patron, so she's a good candidate to fall back on if you need just a bit more oomph to push past that wall if you farm it up. Her ultimate will polymorph her staff into one of 3 things, which will change up her primary attack depending on which one is active. With Pie Plate, she will deal 5 times damage and cleave an additional enemy. With the Owlbear, it will attack instead of her, starting at 3 times her damage, and will increase 2 times the damage for each attack for 5 attacks. While on the Broom, her attack speed and damage are increased by 100%. Basically, one way or the other, she deals more damage while her ultimate is active. Her specialization will solidify her role in your party. The first will increase her attack cooldown by 2 seconds, making her attack slower but increase her damage by 300%. The second will increase her Haunted by 200%, and the third will increase her Poor Hygiene by 100%. Take the first if she is your DPS, the second if she's supporting another DPS and you plan to farm up Haunted, and the last if you're focusing on click debuff, or if you don't plan on focusing to farm up Haunted. She's not the most amazing support, but if you do farm up Haunted, she's pretty good, and her base damage is decent for a starting DPS. Though she doesn't have any crazy opportunities to scale it up in the late game, but she's effective for a click debuff formation as well. I think she's another one riding the line between high B and low A, and pushing just into low A because of that click debuff. Lastly, there is Warden, the chaotic evil Warforged Warlock, who serves as DPS and support, and another follower of the theme simple but effective in this seat. With Warden, it's all about Hex, a sticky debuff applied via their primary attack that eventually stacks up to 4 times with Relentless Hex, and will spread like a plague when a debuffed enemy is killed with Master of Hexes. While Hex is worded as takes more damage from all champions, this does work for click damage as well, making yet another great click debuff formation option in this seat. But the thing is, no one is necessarily competing with Warden, even while being in the same seat, because Warden's debuff is sticky. Therefore, once you've applied a fair amount of hexes, you can just swap to Strix and have even more debuffage. And even if you wouldn't otherwise use Warden in a pushing formation, they make an excellent choice at your wall to stack up those hexes, then switch to your preferred support for that little extra oomph. Warden's ult will pull enemies together in the middle of the screen to group them up, with a very simple specialization choice between making their primary attack hit more times with a chance to stun for more damage, or hit as an AoE for less damage. Basically, take the first if you happen to be using Warden as your DPS, and the second if you are debuffing. Not because the AoE will apply Hex on all targets, mind you, because it doesn't, but because you're likely to be pairing Warden with Freely in a debuff formation, which means you'll be cleaving enemies for more procs on Freely's lucky breaks. Check out the Seat 7 video if you want to know more about Freely. Hex is the only way Warden buffs the formation, and it's decent and sticky, so very useful. But by itself, it's really nothing crazy. I think Warden falls into a hard B. And that wraps up Seat 11, the simple but effective roster of bangers, and then Jamilah. Put a mirror image up on that sub, like, and bell. Leave a comment on what you think about these champions. Follow my Twitter for updates, and if you made it this far, I appreciate the watch. Thanks for choosing to spend your time here. Have a hell of a time out there, pterodactyls.